Collaboration between, we've held a panel like this in collaboration between the Smithsonian and the Center for Intellectual Property and Innovation Policy since 2017. For many years, we held these in person in a programming space here at the National Museum of American History. And so I'm going to start today with a bit of historical background that gives some context on the topic, but also gives you a sense of some of the historical artifacts in our museum and in our exhibits that relate very much to today's topic. Before I do that, I do want to give a quick introduction to our panelists who you're going to hear from momentarily. So as I mentioned, I'm Arthur Demrich, Director of the Lemelson Center for the Study of Invention and Innovation at the Smithsonian. We're joined today by Jonathan Barnett, Senior Fellow for Innovation Policy at the Center for Innovation Policy and Intellectual Property. And he is Professor of Law at the University of Southern California Gould School of Law. We have Dedrick Carter, Vice Chancellor for Innovation and Chief Commercialization Officer at Washington University in St. Louis. And we have Valencia Martin Wallace, the Deputy Commissioner for Patents at the United States Patent and Trademark Office. And Sean Connor, Professor of Law and Faculty Director of the George Mason University Center for Intellectual Property and Innovation Policy, will be joining us momentarily. I want to start with a piece of international trade. This comes from the colonial period, and what you see here is a tea chest that George Washington ordered in 1757. The chest, clearly made in China, but also clearly made for export, not for domestic consumption, was of course shipped to the US not from China, but from London. The US in the colonial period could only trade with the rest of the world via London, and that of course was one of the factors that contributed to the American Revolution. It was a time of high tariffs and of quite controlled trade. We come then to the 1790s. The US as an independent nation is one of the first to set up an intellectual property policy and an intellectual property office, a patent office. And what we see here is a patent license agreement between the holder of the first US patent issued in 1790, that's Samuel Hopkins, who received a patent for an improved method for manufacturing potash. Potash in colonial America was incredibly important as a fertilizer and was produced by burning hardwood trees. He went around licensing this on the American frontier, which at the time is upstate New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Pennsylvania. And here's an agreement with a property owner in Rutland, Vermont, who's agreeing to license this. The 1790s into the early 1800s then becomes a period of kind of boom and bust cycles in American technology. We have the building of canals, then later rail, variety of transportation and communications technologies with huge investment, but then also big crashes, which kind of can resonate to this day. What you see here is then the product of an era of independent inventors. So the innovation system in the US in the 19th century is largely one of independent inventors, people coming up with ideas, submitting them to the patent office, and then either trying to build a business or trying to find someone to license it to. And it is important to add that that innovation system was by no means inclusive. Minorities and women, especially, were not included. At the same time, there is strong evidence that African Americans, especially between 1870 and 1940, held a share of patents equal to their share of the population. And in fact, African Americans living in the American North patented at rates higher than in the South, or in fact greater than any immigrant group except those from England or Germany. And we know that this period ended with lower patenting, in part thanks to Lisa Cook's work around the violence acted out against African Americans in the US. We then have the rise out of this era of independent inventors into corporate R&D and the beginnings of kind of an innovation system. So here's an effort to systematically invest in scientific work and turn it into consumer products. General Electric is generally seen as the first corporation to do this on a larger scale. And so you see scientists like Langmuir, Whitney, Coolidge, and others, several of whom would go on to win Nobel Prizes, scientists then doing applied technical work as well. So that boundary between pure science and the applied begins to break down in this period. and you see really a prosperous growth. By the time we have the onset of World War I, we had a period of incredible trade and kind of globalization. And then it comes to a grinding, painful halt. What you see here is indigo that came from a shipment of some 125 tons of highly sought chemicals, dyes, in 1916 that were shipped by submarine to avoid an English blockade on Germany. The US had not yet entered the war, including this indigo dye sample. Those samples, the dye itself was worth millions of dollars, and so it was worth transporting on a submarine. The US, once it entered the war, would void German patents, and in an effort to build up a domestic industry, handed that intellectual property over to US firms. We then had this interwar period, Great Depression, a period of rising tariffs, of reduced international trade, and then, of course, World War II. Out of World War II comes a new form of science policy and a kind of consensus on what the roles of government, industry, and other areas will be. We have this famous report by Vannevar Bush, Science, the Endless Frontier. We have national labs, for example, the Lawrence Livermore lab here, a particle accelerator, big science. I mean, look at the scale of that. And then things like Bell Labs, so a monopoly provider, AT&T, being able to set up a huge research lab in its own pristine private campus out in the middle of nowhere. This is really a world away from those independent inventors. And yet that system comes under real stress come the early 1970s. The oil embargo, the spike in gas prices that we saw in the early 70s, which of course feels very present today, and then the major antitrust movement against both AT&T and IBM. The AT&T case leads to the breakup of the monopoly. It's arguable the long-term impacts, but there's a good argument to be made that we might not have had BlackBerry, we might not have had the cell phone that we have today had that monopoly held. IBM is not broken up, and yet in the stress of being under an antitrust, it is argued that it created a certain amount of space for the personal computer industry to grow up, for Apple and for even Microsoft to come into being in a way they might not have. And that brings me up to about 1980 as a major turning point. And as a result of these kind of policy tensions in the 70s, we get the Bayh-Dole Act, which allows recipients of federal funds to patent. We get the Diamond v. Chakrabarty Supreme Court case that allows the patenting of genetically modified organisms. And of course, in 1980, Genentech goes public with the fastest one-day stock price increase up to that point in history. And since then, in the 90s and 2000s, the US has really been seen worldwide as an innovation powerhouse, a place where countries from around the world come to look and say, what can we learn from this system? We have this, it's a complex to describe as a system. We have DARPA, we have other federal funders, we have universities, we have a lot of entrepreneurs and private startups, and there's a very complex set of tech transfers that come across. There's been a lot of movement and a lot of kind of innovation in the system, and yet it feels very under threat at present, which is the topic, of course, of today's panel. And so with that, I'm going to ask the panelists to all turn their cameras on and join me. And so welcome, everyone. So having set that up that way, I do want to invite each of the panelists to make some comments on how they see the system at present, stresses, tensions, and opportunities. Perhaps we could start with Valencia.
Thank you, Arthur, and thank you so much for inviting me to be here for this really exciting and interesting topic. I'm excited to participate and to hear from the distinguished panelists as well. And I think you laid out an excellent history of our IP and innovation system, and from my perspective as a member of the patent system, 30 years as a patent examiner, manager, and executive, I've seen amazing growth in all aspects of our innovation system and how it works together. It's constantly changing. We cannot stagger IP, even if we wanted to. The constant advancements in technology, the laws that need to keep up with those advancements, and the struggles that we're dealing with right now with AI and other emerging technologies are a huge example of how that growth, while sometimes can be painful, is definitely necessary to advance our innovation system. What I'd like to talk about a little bit is you've touched on as well is the how women and people of color have participated in the system in the past, how they have or have not been embraced within our IP and innovation systems. Currently, we are looking.
We lost you, Valencia.
Yeah, Valencia, you muted somehow, or your audio went out.
Yet, unfortunately, only about 13% of those women actually see their names on patents as inventors.
Valencia,
So I'm
I'm
going to
sorry,
stop right there.
your audio
Uh,
cut out for a second. Could you say that again?
Oh, absolutely. So I was mentioning how while we've seen great advancements within the innovation system and IP, still a great way to go. And some of the things that you mentioned in your opening remarks with the participation of women and the participation of people of color, we have a long way left to go. And Progress and Potential Report, which was a dynamic look at the state of our IP system, specifically patents, and how diverse it is or the lack of diversity. One of the things that was mentioned was the fact that there are about 30% of our engineering and science fields are women, yet only about 13% of women see their names on patents as inventors. So there's a lack of equity. Not only do we need to improve the number of women that are going into the STEM fields, we need to actually provide that equity in it being lucrative for them as patentees, as having a piece of that level of our IP system, and the monetary value there is not properly shared. And that's with women. With people of color, sadly enough, there aren't enough statistics that are even available to know how specifically they are participating. Yet we do know that is much lower than the numbers that I mentioned to you about women. So I am always encouraged by the IP system, by our innovation system, about collectively working together to improve on technology, to improve on the laws that govern that technology. But we still have a long way to go to bring about a more inclusive innovation ecosystem that's going to bring about those further advancements. The number of women and people of color is staggering, as well as growing our economy. How much we are leaving behind by leaving women and people of color behind and not including them, giving them the access, giving them the opportunities and the education and awareness, not only in STEM, but in the next steps of STEM. And how do you invent? How do you receive a patent? And I apologize. I think I went out again.
You did, but I know that's one of the major points we're going to come back to in just a couple minutes. So let me turn it over next to Dedrick to give his kind of opening thoughts on the topic.
Thank you very much, Arthur. It's great to be here with you all. I appreciate it. You know, when I was a graduate student, I was given a unique opportunity to sit with a cohort of engineering students and law students from two premier institutions. And the purpose was to posit the challenges and solutions of the nascent technological age. Larry Lessig at the time was at the beginning of his career, and he joined with Hal Abelson at MIT around a set of notes that Larry had written and we collectively used in the class to spur discussion. The output of the interactions, the edits, the fora, the assignments, and the presentations were reflected in the final version of a book that was called Code and the Laws of Cyberspace. Several years later, Larry went on to write a book that comes to mind now as we think about the future as a community. That book was titled The Future of Ideas, The Fate of the Commons in a Connected World. In this work, the idea really emerged that the internet produced a counter-revolution, a revolution of really devastating power and effect. The creativity flourished because the internet protected an important element of equity and access, and this is relevant to what Valencia was saying earlier, and innovation commons. The innovation commons lowered barriers of entry and allowed for an expression of ideas, engagement, and interaction that had been experienced in few other democratization zones. You can read the more current work of Tim Berners-Lee, the architect of the open internet, to see calls for continuing efforts to foster these principles. And those who have taken my seminar, Engineering Thought, will know that in fact, the establishment of those principles date back to the work of the Electronic Frontier Foundation in their missive, the Magna Carta of the Knowledge Age, which shaped a generation of pioneers for openness and access. The reason I bring all this up is that concept of the future of ideas leads me to the future of innovation, access, and participation in higher education, really the sort of fight for relevance. So I begin with a really important question. Are we prepared to collectively combat a circumstance in which our capacity to create is constrained and confined by, one, an architecture of control, two, limited connections, and a lack of awareness of the importance of context, particularly local context? I believe that there are really three ways that one can change their station in life. You can have inheritance or legacy. That's sort of the prior generation attained or created, and you are the beneficiary of that. Lottery, your number's up, you get lucky. Go buy a ticket. And the third is learning, preparation for and keen observation of opportunities that may present themselves at a point in time that you can take hold of. Inheritance has often been bimodal. It's kind of either the conservative, the risk averse, don't be the generation that loses it, or the erratic, irresponsible, carpe diem, unaware or desensitized to the effort involved in actually amassing the benefit. The lottery is just sort of how lucky are you feeling? But that traditional, solid changing of your station in life has been education and the outputs of those education, research, and research to translation and commercialization. So I do think that the times are shifting. In the years since the rise of the great higher education state, higher education, there's been a shift in the thinking about the role of education. And I really believe that one of our biggest challenges in higher education is to seek to build and maintain relevance to the greater population. Knowledge for the sake of knowledge is interesting, and we find that still across our communities, but the application of knowledge to the common purpose of mankind, womankind, personhood, if you will, is something that cannot be overlooked. And so we have to think about that at this inflection point. I love this quote by Nikki Giovanni. A lot of people resist transition and therefore never allow themselves to enjoy who they are, embrace the change, no matter what it is. Once you know and do, and you can learn about the new world, you're able to take advantage of it. And so I believe that we're positioned at an inflection point where we're sort of rethinking what innovation is, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. We're rethinking the role of the university and intellectual property commercialization and how we fuel economic development. And there's a great emphasis and an infusion of capital in trying to excite the economy and workforce development coming out of these areas. And so to the question of is it similar or different than the 1970s, I think anytime you find yourself at an inflection point, it feels similar because you've been there before. I do believe that life happens in spirals, not circles. So hopefully we're spiraling up and that it's just a similar place and not the same place.
That's a beautiful metaphor. Thank you, Dedrick. Jonathan.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to appear on this distinguished panel. I really look forward to our conversation today. And Arthur, your opening remarks are really close to my heart because I've spent much of my career working on what could be called the economic history of the US patent system, plus the patent relevant parts of the antitrust system. And from that perspective, I think we're at a really interesting time in the US patent system from a historical point of view, because we're at a juncture point where if you date things roughly from the Supreme Court's 2006 decision in eBay v. Merck Exchange, which for those who aren't familiar with it, substantially limited the availability of injunctive relief. That has been followed by actions both by the antitrust agencies, the US Congress with the American Invents Act, and in particular by the US Supreme Court, with the result being that everything else being equal, if you have a patent in your hands today, it's worth a lot less than it was on the eve of the eBay v. Merck exchange decision. And there's a very rich debate about whether that's a good or bad thing. But I think the historical perspective is helpful in appreciating that the US patent system is sort of like a pendulum. We've had periods when the patent strength has been high. That has been roughly around the late 19th through the early 20th century. We've had periods when patent strength was even weaker than today. It's a very long period that's often forgotten, roughly from the late New Deal all the way through the 1970s. And there's a really interesting pattern if you look at that century plus period. When the patent system is robust, the individual inventor has a prominent role. The small firm inventor has a prominent role. The technology transfer division of a research university has a prominent role. When the patent system is weak, it's not that innovation collapses as patent advocates would expect. But what we do see is that innovation tends to take place in those big, giant labs in the middle of nowhere, New Jersey, that we saw. And we don't see a lot of small firm innovation. And I think that's where we are at the juncture point today. Do we want to have, because this is what history tends to tell us, do we want to have a patent system that works well for the largest platform companies only? Or do we want to have a patent system that can also work well for the small firm inventor, the individual inventor, and the research institution? So it's, as I said, I think it's an exciting time. There's a lot of, for policymakers, I think there's it's a real point in history where an impact can be made. I look forward to hearing everyone's thoughts today. Thank you.
Great. Okay. I'm just joining a little bit late. Thanks, Arthur, for subbing in. You had to do double duty and both being a speaker and the moderator function. I'm Sean O'Connor. I'm the faculty director of the Center for Intellectual Property by Innovation Policy. We were caught up in another event related to the center. So we've had all of our opening comments, and we have a great set of panelists here. And now we want to do some directed questions. Although, Jonathan, you did kind of get us pretty far down the road with our first one. So this question may sound a little redundant, but I want to have everyone else chime in as well. So Dedrick and Valencia. And so in many ways, as Jonathan was suggesting, we are looking at historical episodes now to see where we're going right now. Now, of course, history doesn't repeat itself exactly. Most people have on their taglines now, history never repeats, but it often rhymes. I don't know why that's a meme right now, but so many people use that on their SIG blocks. So is it repeating or rhyming? And so some of us are speculating that we're re-entering a period like the 1970s. It's hard not to think about that if you're old enough to remember stagflation and lines at the gas pump and all that kind of good stuff. So is that what's happening? Are we entering a period like that? And if that's true, do we go back to policy prescriptions of the 1970s, which, as our panelists have already essentially alluded to or said, that's what gave us Bayh-Dole and whatnot, was Bayh-Dole is the culmination of things going on in the 1970s. So let's think about that question. Are we entering a period like the 1970s, stagflation and whatnot? And then what will be the relationship among major parts of the US innovation system? Jonathan, do you want to continue on, or should we move to one of the other panelists? I think you can say more on this.
Sure. I think if we're looking at innovation systems, it's not one size fits all. It's a symbiotic habitat, if I can use that ecological metaphor. So publicly funded research is really important. I think it's generally agreed that the private market often has weak incentives to undertake basic research. And the reason is simple, that they can't internalize all the gains from it. Although some of the largest companies, we do see them undertaking moonshot type projects. And so publicly funded research is critical. But privately funded research is often, if not typically, critical in taking that basic research and converting it into products and services that can actually help consumers. Let me illustrate this symbiosis metaphor with the example of the BioNTech Pfizer vaccine. That grew out of decades of federally funded research and government-funded research in other countries on converting using the mRNA technology for purposes of developing a vaccine. But that was only commercialized through the interaction of the private market and the publicly funded research. And the patent system was critical in making that happen. Without a patent, the scientists founders, the immigrant founders of BioNTech, it is unlikely they would have been able to secure the VC money with which they founded the company. It would have been very difficult for them to comfortably enter into negotiations with the very sophisticated people over at Pfizer who could replicate everything that's been disclosed to them in the negotiating room. It's often said that patents raise transaction costs and they block innovation. I think it's often overlooked that patents actually lower transaction costs by bringing together two parties to the table, both of which are necessary. We needed the innovation from the BioNTech scientists, but we needed the capital and the production facilities of Pfizer to churn out tens of millions, hundreds of millions of doses and get that shipped around the world. So I think the key thing is it's a system of moving parts, and it's a system where we need cooperation between public and private money, and we need robust property rights to make all that happen.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. Dedrick,
Sure.
comments from you on this question?
Yes, I mean, I think I love where Jonathan started taking us there, and he mentioned that sort of the private can't really capture all the gains, and the second part of that is they also can't really stomach the timeline for the need for Horizon. So what you alluded to in your comments, and so that is why you do need to have the ability for higher education and us to go after knowledge for knowledge sake. To sort of science the endless frontier, to be able to sort of go out there and explore and look for things that you don't really know what the purpose or goal will be just yet, but that may be revealed to you in time. And so the universities in this sort of delicate ecosystem balance, and first of all, just take a step back and ask the question, what is innovation? We throw this around a lot. And a few years ago, I was on a panel with the Dr. Chidambaram, who's the science advisor to India, and we were talking about innovation ecosystems at the AAAS, and someone in the audience raised their hand and they said, "So what do you mean by innovation?" And the first thing you think is, here's a heckler, we know how to handle that. And then you think it's actually a really important question. I mean, we use that term quite frequently, but let's unpack it a bit. And so when I talk about innovation, I want to give you the perspective that I think, but I think, and this is I'm partial to this definition, we sort of created it on the spot in this area. Innovation is when one finds economic, strategic, or societal value in fundamental knowledge. Fundamental knowledge is free, or in this case, deeply subsidized by the government. Though in this budget situation, it's not always clear what that subsidy will be. But value creation is not free. And so the idea that you need to go out and sort of have knowledge generated, but it is incumbent on us to think about how you take that knowledge and generate value from it. It's sort of in the innovation entrepreneurial ecosystem, value creation is the coin of the realm. Universities should be at the forefront of creating such value, and it should be the fuel and the lifeblood of a healthy economy. And you have to have an environment in the government that is conducive with policies that sort of help to support and promote that kind of environment. And so I think the symbiosis, getting to the point, if you look at our technology transfer, often what we have now is dollars moving further down the chain. And so the early dollars, when you can take something out and try to de-risk it, you're seeing institutions try to move things further along in the de-risking process so that there's greater potential on exit because the dollars are moving farther down the chain. And so I think what you'll see is a relationship change over time on where exits and where other people intervene, and where partnership and sort of the smart first looks will be instituted, so that I know I have something that feels important. What are the 2 or 3 things that you would like to see done before you would be interested in this technology, this opportunity, this potential venture? And that sort of combination of conversations happening regularly, particularly at our institutions. I'll pause there.
Great. Thanks so much for that. Valencia, your thoughts?
So great conversation so far. I'll start with just directly saying, no, I don't think we're going backwards. I think the advancements in our technology challenge us, such as with the AI, and those challenges are forcing us to relook at the laws and forcing us to look at the regulations, and keeping up with the technology, with the laws is a huge challenge, but I think it's all advancement. And similar to what Dedrick was saying, it starts with the education aspects of it. And one of the things that I have learned in my work in expanding innovation at the USPTO is, as I go in and talk to kids, 10-year-old kids who are inventing and excited about those inventions, and understanding at that age the value of those inventions, then I know our system is only going to get better. But it's reaching out, it's the access at those ages. At the age of 3 and 4 years old, I am a firm believer that yes, we should be training and educating our children on STEM, especially supporting our young girls in that field. But they can also learn about innovation. They can learn about invention. They should be learning at that age as well about how to invent, taking those ideas and inventing, taking those ideas and being an innovator. They can learn it just as well as they can learn anything else, and just building on that education at every step of the way, not only in the invention aspects of it, but the innovation aspects of it. Yes, our technology is moving faster than our laws that govern it, but that is the challenge of our society, to keep up with it and to keep moving forward. I think also, as for the place of innovation, the innovation system and how we work at it together, I think I've seen a lot of really great advancements, especially in the last few years, as we have this shining light on the issues with diversity, inclusion, and equity in our IP and IP system and our innovation system, that every sector we are supporting, that we're supporting our SMEs, our small and medium enterprises, that we're supporting our independent inventors, because it's not only those advancements in the large industry, but it's those advancements in someone's kitchen that is helping all aspects, the large industry as well as the government, as well as academia and health. And it is the combination of our sectors of innovation working together and collaborating to not only spur that invention and innovation, but to protect it as well. And an example of which is U.S. Patent Office. We work in patents and trademarks. We're not the enforcers, but we have knowledge, education, support to enforcement in order to stave off fraudulent activity within the IP communities, not only domestically, but more importantly, globally, to make sure that we, as an innovation community, are supporting and doing our part at every aspect of the IP system, the innovation system, protecting not only our patents, but how do we then utilize and leverage trademarks, copyrights, as well as we seek to commercialize and monetize those inventions. So I'll stop right there.
Perfect. That's great. And you're actually setting us up nicely for the next question. But I want to pause for a moment and pull together some of the things that our panelists were saying, adding a little bit from my own background research. But one thing that's incredibly important, I think, is to recognize among our panelists now the range of inventive activity. And what I mean by that in particular is that some inventors are simply solving a problem that's in front of them. They don't necessarily need to tap into new basic science research knowledge that's come out. They have a problem presented with them, and as Valencia is saying, they're inventing at their kitchen table. Maybe they don't know a lot about STEM. Now, it'd be great if they do know more, but you can invent perfectly great things without actually having any deep knowledge of science or technology behind it. And almost the opposite end of the spectrum, what Dedrick was focused on quite a bit, is what we do in the universities, where it is true, as he's mentioning, curiosity-driven research. There is no necessary application coming out of it. It is a researcher just wanting to understand how a natural phenomenon works, how something works in the world. So there's another kind of invention where we say, how are we going to apply that new insight that comes out of the basic science research? So all of this has to be factored into how we have a successful innovation system. So now, given that, understanding that gamut, everything from PhD, basic science researchers, not doing applied work necessarily, but having, here's a new insight about how some natural phenomena works, all the way to someone who has almost no training, perhaps in STEM fields, but can invent a really great thing. Now let's talk, though, about diversity and the strength that it can play for innovation in the US in particular, where we have an amazingly diverse population. So the next question then to our panelists is, looking at diversity in the US across our population is a strength for innovation, but what needs to be done to increase that participation? So Valencia, is it okay if I go back to you? You've already started down this road, but tell us more what the PTO is doing and what we can do more generally to increase access for diverse population members so they can benefit from the patent system.
Thank you so much, Sean. And yes, I could talk about this for hours, but I'm going to limit myself. So please cut me off because I can go on and on and on. But yes, the USPTO has looking and had a great focus for many years on intellectual property and bringing more women, people of color into the fold of being inventors, being patent owners, owning trademarks. We have done a great deal of training and education, but as of the last maybe 2 to 3 years, really started looking at our place in the innovation system as a whole. And as I had mentioned before, we have amazing programs out there teaching the youngest among us to get them more educated and aware of STEM and the creation and the excitement behind it. But we have to move beyond that. And that's one of the things the Patent Office has been doing, is moving beyond how to get our kids into STEM and how to make them inventors, how to take what they're learning in the STEM fields or in the art fields, and then develop that into ideas that turn into inventions, that turn into supporting our economy. So one of the things that we've done is develop the Council for Inclusive Innovation. And this goes back to what we were talking about a little bit earlier about whose job is it? You know, how do we as an innovation system work together? We is members of all aspects of our innovation community. So we have venture capitalists, we have university presidents, we have CEOs of major industry, we have small business owners. We have independent inventors, and we also have professional organizations, because it's not the Patents Office responsibility. It is all of our responsibility to make sure that we're bringing awareness, we're bringing opportunity to learn more about invention and innovation, and to support that inventor and innovator at every step of their journey towards commercialization and monetization of their ideas. So we've stood up the council. We've done had great support and ideas from that council in how to move forward. And we're currently working on the development of a national strategy to do exactly what I just mentioned. Starting at the age of 3 and 4 years old, what should we be teaching our youngest on not only STEM and how to invent, but about the whole innovation community and process. And then moving along with them as they grow into practicing that innovation as well. And also, how do each of the sectors of our community support that venture as they're growing? And we have women and people of color in universities and large industry. How does that industry, how does the university support them? How do they bring better opportunity so that there is equity within the system for people of color and for women? And then along that path to realization, how do we then, as a community, support commercialization, support the funding necessary in order for an independent inventor or a small business owner to then see success, which breeds success for our economy? So that's where we are now, is pulling together every sector of our community to come together and address the problem of making sure every inventor, every innovator has access, has opportunity to realize their ideas.
Oh, that's perfect. I almost didn't know what to say at the end of that. It was such a good, impassioned talk on that. And I also want to give the PTO even extra credit, Valencia, for the clinical program that you all have been leading on too. And so basically a lot of law schools around the country have clinics that then for low or no cost will help people often from marginalized communities to get patents issued. And so that's another way of trying to get access and get people who have diverse backgrounds in. So now let's move over to Dedrick, talk about the role of universities and how we increase diversity across the innovation spectrum.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. I'll tell you, one of the most important concepts in this, and this is something that Valencia alluded to, is really entrepreneurial intention. So we know that the pipeline is often considered small, and we're growing the pipeline for those who are studying and engaged in STEM. But I think about my daughters who are 3, 6, and 8. And who have this unquenchable curiosity for stuff. You know, let me build this, and can we create it? And so they're drawing up things all the time, and they're sort of thinking about the craziest idea and some of those things we act on. It really is sort of helping them to see themselves as creators and inventors, and that curiosity, the fun, the sort of novelty around that is what is really critical. It's almost like the quote that many of us hear from Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, The Little Prince: if you want to build a ship, don't drum up men or gather wood, divide the work or give orders. Instead, teach them to yearn for the vast and endless sea. And so that planting that seed early, it's the Disney world helping to believe in magic and dream, I think, is critical. Entrepreneurial intention is a term of art. And we have to have people see themselves as entrepreneurs, as builders. We also have to make sure that that is a sought after goal or role in society, that it's not just the quirky weird over in the corner, but it is someone who is, it's a role that's aspired to and then has a great value. Years ago, I was at the National Science Foundation and as a senior advisor, and helped to start a program called the NSF Innovation Corps. And we thought about that as, let's think about how you activate a multi-billion dollar, at the time, $7 billion agency, and move some of the fruit to that towards new ventures. Well, if you look at women and minorities who have venture-backed companies, have access to capital, is less than 3%. And so there's work that we need to do. My institution is going to be launching an effort around that sometime soon. But there's work that we need to do to look at what are the structures and impediments to access in these environments, in addition to things like I-Corps that instrument in just a normal way of things. If you're going to do research at a research intensive institution and you're in the small percentage of people that are women and people of color that are involved in that work, then you're going to know the NSF, you're going to know the NIH, you're going to know DARPA and others. And if there are programs there that are a natural translation that help you to learn about this work and to perhaps move your innovations forward, then that is instrumenting in the native pipeline in higher education. So I think those sorts of efforts are really critical. I'll say one other thing. I helped to bring a program to Missouri called the Missouri Lewis Stokes Alliance for Minority Participation in STEM, LSAM. Many people know that. It's growing STEM participation in minority areas. But the focus of this was to say, if you want to grow STEM retention, you want to think about STEM pathways that aren't, so you don't like STEM, let me tell you how to spend the next 6, 8, 10 years doing something that you don't care for. That's not a great value proposition. It's one that we can sort of, make, but if you say you want to be rich, or you want to create this thing, then you can actually, move your knowledge of STEM in this direction. And so we thought about an important element of a pathway there being invention and entrepreneurship as a natural outgrowth of STEM education. And I agree with you, Sean, that invention happens on multiple scales. It happens with lack of a deep knowledge, but it also happens in deep tech ventures where there's lots of knowledge. The important element is that it's packaging up the outputs of curiosity in a commercial vehicle, whether it's a license or a new venture that you start yourself, a license to an existing venture or a new venture you start yourself. We have to understand that if you really truly want your discovery to impact the world, the commercial vehicle is probably the requirement to make that happen. And that understanding helps you to grow entrepreneurial intention.
Great, thanks so much for that. And I mentioned plug for Missouri too. Not only do you have all the great universities, yours and the University of Missouri system as well, but also Kaufman Foundation still does quite a bit coming out of there. They've had some great programs on entrepreneurship and again, trying to reach out to more diverse populations for it. Arthur, let's bring you back into the mix.
Yeah,
Talk more about thinking about STEM participation.
Thank you. Yeah. So the Lemelson Center team that I'm director of, one of our main areas of work is a program we call Spark Lab, which is a hands-on invention space here at the National Museum of American History and across a network of other museums and science centers. And the key aspect to how we understand Spark Lab is really kind of twofold. One is a hands-on space. It's informal, that there are many hours outside of school in which we can, should, and need to engage young people, especially girls, especially people of color, in invention, to give them that empowered sense that I can do this. And working with your hands in a tactile manner is really fundamental to invention, we've found. We study how inventors have worked through history. And even a company, interestingly, like Autodesk, that does, AutoCAD, a totally digital design software. I've spoken with them and they said, we absolutely physically prototype everything, 100%. You can't tell if you don't physically touch it, see it, feel it. And so that's critical, and we think that skill set's important. And then a step beyond that is really that the middle school kids in the area, kind of 6 to 12, is a time when we see a huge drop-off in interest and enthusiasm in science and engineering fields. And part of it, I think, is that it gets narrow band and it's not seen as cool. And so what we need to do, all of us, is really identify how we make it fun, cool, interesting, and really empowering for young people. And again, especially kids from communities that haven't had as much of a legacy in recent years of it. We saw they did historically, and who find a lot of extra challenges. And that does bring me to a couple of other thoughts. One is we're doing a lot of work on what you might call an inventive identity. So what is it that shapes an identity and how do people act on it? And how do we empower them to really see themselves as part of the innovation system? And then out of that comes a kind of provocative thought, or I'm just curious what other people think, which is, we have a pretty clear understanding of what's patentable, what counts as intellectual property. There's, arguments around the edges. And yet, one of the things I've really seen in recent years is there's a huge amount of innovation that comes out of minority communities that isn't recognized as patentable. It isn't, an intellectual property that you get a patent on. But maybe that's just means we need to broaden how we think about what's patentable. So, there's an argument property is theft, so the anarchist, the proudhon, and yet absence of property is theft. So when kids make up dance routines and then a major video game company incorporates it in the game and profits from it, and the kid in the community came up with their friends with that dance move doesn't, we can't pretend like some form of, that we haven't lost something in that. And so can we think about community-based intellectual property? Can we think about other forms of credit that give recognition to young people who are coming up with these innovations, not all of which are physical technology, not all of which are instantly monetized, and yet an awful lot of them do get monetized, right? The American Black community, the African American community is a source of so much of music, culture, art, design, and you name it. And yet it doesn't, and now we give credit to it. People are doing that work. but we're still not actually flowing the property rights and the funding that comes with that. So I think that's, a challenge for the next decade, as it were.
Perfect. Thanks. Great comments. Before I turn to Jonathan, I just want to note that we will return to maker activities, maker spaces, fab labs, and the maker movement. One of our attendees has already put a question into the chat about that. Very much come back to that. I do also like that we're bringing in some of these other areas. I also am a fan of the acronym STEAM rather than just STEM. So we get the arts and creativity in there. And then just mentioning, Arthur, yes, thinking about know-how and show-how. Usually protectable under trade secrets, if anything, but that's a really important area of innovation. So with that, Jonathan, I think you might have a lot to say about this, about the broad range of innovation that happens.
Yeah, I mean, this point is a policy win-win all around. It's key to our national competitiveness, to the robustness of our innovation system. We want to diversify our innovator base as broadly as possible. That's how we maximize our chances of the next big idea. It also has the effect, and we know this from especially that independent inventor period of the late 19th, early 20th century. A patent, when it's embedded within that whole commercialization process that a lot of the other panels have been talking about, is often a vehicle for upward mobility. It allows you to realize the value that is embedded in your innovation. And I know we're mostly talking about the patent system here today, but there's a commonality in the historical spirit, even if never fully realized, in both the patent copyright system from the origins of that system in the U.S., which specifically distinguished it from the European predecessors. And Zarina Khan has talked about this in particular. And that was the emphasis on the patent and the copyright as being a personal right of the artist or the inventor, a way for the artist or the inventor to realize the value. And I'll just end with a practical point. One of the key ways in which the US patent system implemented this from day one, their fees for applying for the patent were drastically lower than the British patent system. And just a practical point, which is really important to appreciate today, is that the Patent Office has admirably done a lot to reduce the fees for small entities and individual inventors. But it's important to appreciate, and Sean was alluding to this with the efforts some law schools have made. That's not the main cost. I'll plead guilty. I'm a lawyer. We're the main cost. The lawyers are the main cost. And if you want to expand that access, as we should, across the demographic and income spectrum for inventors, we need to do something meaningful to reduce the legal costs that are necessary to get the ball rolling. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. And I should also be remiss if I didn't add that not only has the PTO done a lot to foster and support clinics at law schools, both on the patent and the trademark side, to give essentially these free legal services, but also coordinating in major population areas around the country, pro bono networks of patent attorneys, who then, for people of low incomes and other kinds of backgrounds, then can get, at least for the first time through, can get the first patent free from attorneys. And when someone makes enough money and they can afford it, of course, they should pay our fees, right, Jonathan? But but until then, we need to give them some more access into it. So now,
Sean, if I could just add one other point to that in terms of the cost. I mean, this is another area where institutions of higher education can play a role. Many institutions have IP law clinics that are focused on, if they have law schools, that are focused on working with the community to try to lower the cost overall for entrepreneurs and inventors to be able to protect their assets.
Yeah, absolutely. And then in some of them, some that some of you may know I'm familiar with, we also do the corporate piece as well to help them form the companies, help them make sure their tax profile is correct, help them get their leases and all these kinds of things, because there's a lot more floating around. And I-Corps, Dedrick, as you know, is well set up to training. That's the point of your of the I-Corps program, is to get them down the road and understanding this. Okay, let's now, actually, Dedrick, we're going to stay with you now, because let's shift to our next question, which is the role of universities, particular anchor institutions, by which I mean, the or one of the major research institutions in a region. What are those universities? What role do they play in advancing the entrepreneurial ecosystem in their regions?
Yeah, I definitely appreciate it. As you said, if you think about what's the role of the anchor institution, and I define that by those who have a physical presence and is integral to the social, cultural, economic well-being of the community, I think there are many, and it's important for the institution to view itself as as embracing that role of being an anchor institution. I think first is to help identify the strengths of their respective regions and create educational entrepreneurial support programs toward those strengths. I mean, I-Corps is an element of that that's often offered through schools, but in our region, we have BioSTL, co-working spaces, workforce development. So thinking about not just the individuals that you attract from all over to learn, but those that you have in your community who can come in for shorter courses and benefit from the magnetic appeal of your organization. And I say that as those who attract from all over. There are clearly great institutions that attract from right around, and they are sort of the engines in those communities that help to grow and build, and often folks stay very close by. I think we're seeing more of an opportunity for institutions to work together and not against others. Cooperation is important in terms of increasing participation. We see partnerships with historically minority serving institutions. We see partnerships with community colleges. It really, I go back to the National Science Foundation and thinking about the National Innovation Network, or the hub system that they have, which is how do you bring together collections of anchor institutions among regions so that the nodes and the networks that you have there give you something greater than the sum of its parts, where you may actually expire or exhaust your limited resources in the space. It may not be dollar resources, but it could be expertise or people that are entrepreneurs in a region that could be taxed if you grow your entrepreneurial capacity in a space. But if you tap into an adjacent space through a network, then you can actually see perhaps a better and stronger innovation network because you're sharing across a larger basis. I think really universities should be the connective tissue for a productive entrepreneurial environment, thinking about mentors and partners and the resources that we need to bring together, working to try to remove the barriers and grow. And in general, thinking about what's happened in these period post-pandemic. So, the anchor institutions and regions are very much like government in some ways. You're almost always going to need to do the work. The research engine is going to keep running. And if you look at what happened during the pandemic for us, the research engine fired up, and we actually probably saw more disclosures, more activity, because people had time to sort of think about entrepreneurial capacity, to think about and work in the labs on new ventures, new ideas, and write those down. And so I really do believe that the role of the anchor institution is understanding not just the production capability, but sort of thinking about that in the context of, if you want to make an impact on society, you're going to need to put something in a commercial vehicle. You're going to need to make sure you grow a culture in your university or college where innovation and entrepreneurship and commercialization is not a dirty word. I carry a title that is both the Vice Chancellor for Innovation and the Chief Commercialization Officer in addition to my faculty roles. And that's very specifically intentioned, because I want to every day someone looks at those two and see the potential tension there and feel okay about one and maybe a little dirty about the other. But to say that we have an obligation under Bayh-Dole, if you want to pursue the fruits of research investigation, if you take the dollars to do that, federal dollars to do that, you have an obligation to figure out if there's an impact on humankind. And so I want to be that walking tension diagram that says, this is not, just let's make lots of money. This is an obligation as an extension of our innovation pursuits. Now, I'll stop by saying, I think that really in our anchor institution, this sort of true grassroots effort at broadening participation really starts with the individual and the school level. It rolls up to the universities, and we think about, our name is Washington University in St. Louis, and I speak just for that. And so we talk about what it means to be in St. Louis and for St. Louis and with St. Louis. And that role we're embracing really deeply, to think about all of our efforts and how they benefit not only the around the walls, but outside the walls. And that sort of conversation is one that sort of helps to tear down hundreds of years of walls that have built up, and some have ivy growing on them, and some are just sort of invisible bubbles. My mother-in-law, there's East St. Louis and there's St. Louis. My mother-in-law grew up in East St. Louis, and she said, my institution was so far away from her as a kid that she never really thought that she'd have a daughter that worked there and a son-in-law that worked. It just wasn't in her being. And I think now those existence proofs are important to share with others and across the communities, to say that there's nothing that's unattainable. And that we have an obligation to make sure those existence proofs are present, not only within the communities, but in the communities around us as key producers and developers of talent.
Yes, absolutely. We used to call that town and down relations.
Yes,
Valencia.
If you don't mind me adding to Dedrick, so what Dedrick is saying, I've been nodding the whole time, yes. The mentoring, the networking, the going out into the local communities, I think that's pivotal for academia. I think it's also other industries and sectors as well, that three things as we're growing, if we want to grow our individuals who will grow our nation, it's mentorship, it's networking, it's allyship. It's working as individuals, but also working together as groups in order to support that and bring that education and access to each other as we see the potential in the inventors, the innovators, the entrepreneurs. And I see a huge part of this being the role of the tech transfer offices as well. Not only internal to the university, and it's, saddest thing that I hear when I go out and speak to some students and faculty in universities is that they don't have a proper understanding of their intellectual property and how it can be grown and the use of their tech transfer offices.
Yes. Yes, and I would also add that in the tech transfer, it can be in that focus on trying to license out or do spin outs in your local region. Sometimes it's a temptation to license out to the deepest pockets, biggest corporation somewhere, but maybe it helps your region even more to license locally. I think now we are going to jump to our last question. And it's one that is interesting that I think all of us have experiences going around the world. Other countries have what they call innovation policies. It's a document or something that says this is the innovation policy for our entire country. Interestingly, the US has not really had that so much. There's different innovation policies at different agencies. And so the question then really, should the US, it's not to say we should, but it's an open question. Should we have something like that? So Valencia, let's go back to you and talk about, in the USPTO's own corner, what has been innovation policy, obviously at a place that does a lot with innovation.
Thank you for that. And yes, well, we do a lot in innovation. I had mentioned earlier in that space, it's really, for us, it's patents, it's trademarks, it's education on such. But for us, it really has been support in other areas. It's our partnerships and our collaborations with other sectors of the innovation and IP communities, with copyright, as well as with DOJ, with trade, with the enforcement agencies to help support their policies in moving forward in building and protecting our system. One of the things that I'm really excited about right now is our new Undersecretary, Kathy Vidal, who has really looked at what we do at the USPTO, not as IP or patents and trademark specific, but innovation as a whole. And I've heard her say it 100 times, and I know I'll hear it much more: innovation to impact. And how do we not only have our role within the innovation system, but how do we support others? So while we don't have a specific formulated policy, we do in our mission and our vision for the agency and meeting the goals of building a stronger IP system, and how we support and collaborate with other sectors in order to make sure that that system is reliable and protected.
Great, thanks. Now, Dedrick, your views on formal innovation policy.
So when I was in the government, I would often say we can tell you in February or March what we could have given you in last October, because you're always sort of thinking about the cycle budget passing a little bit later than you really want it to when you're thinking about plans. And so it's really hard to plan on a moving cycle when you don't have something that's at least on 3 or 5 year windows. And that's what you see in other places. They say, let's look at a 5-year plan, plus or minus, this is where we want to be. This is what we're going to put behind that. And assuming that the economy holds, this is where you want to go. And that's actually in many ways kind of the idea behind an ARPA model. I mean, if you look at the conversations now with NIH and ARPA-H, and so looking at a model that says, let me give you a bolus, let's give a period of time, and let's think about what you will do over that window of time. Big centers, that you need to have some stability in the funding profile to be able to plan for the unplannable, right? So you're looking at how do you pursue new frontiers, and that helps. You need to have some basis in the ability to look at the long horizon, to think fast and slow. So I think we do need to have an innovation policy. I actually think you're going to see more of that kind of policy direction emerge. You're already seeing elements of that emerge post-pandemic. We had a great reset, and in that reset we saw an infusion of people who never saw themselves as inventive, people who had time to spend more time in the lab, people who had time to sniff around labs and say what's out there, people who had these things that were dormant that now are really relevant or potentially relevant if you can tie them to the 100-year event. All of those things have shaken up what is our new reality. And as we bounce forward instead of bounce back, we will see that inflection point has changed us. And I do believe that some ability, I mean, you saw this in the development, the current plan for ARPA-H, which is, here's $1 billion that needs in a 3-year cycle that might have been given for different reasons, a 3-year window, but there's value in having that sort of 3-year window to think about what you're going to do with that that infusion of capital. I realize that it's not all about money when you think about innovation policies, but it is about setting a set of priorities, ambitious priorities, and activating the great minds that we have all over the place to go after those priorities. That is what got us to the moon, and I'm not necessarily encouraging moonshots because that's become a term of the day. But I am saying, so there was a reminder that I got on my screen that on yesterday, 13 years ago, I shook the hand of Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin at an event that we were hosting when I was at MIT. And I talked about the value of reaching for high and low fruits, right? The sort of that small step is something that really transformed us. And I think it's that sort of conversation that we want to have, not only in our labs, but in our living rooms, where people are really interested in thinking about what it takes. And that sort of helps us to move forward. I really do believe that you can't, can we move the needle without innovation policy? Yes. Can we switch out the dial? No. And I'm really interested in how you switch the dial, not really just move the needle.
Nice. It's a great metaphor and a good point. Arthur, your views.
Yeah, so as I thought about today's panel, I was really thinking about us in a real deep crisis moment. And so it's actually been encouraging to me to hear the other speakers. I think I come out of this with more confidence and hope than I had coming in, frankly. So I do think we're in a moment of genuine crisis in democracy and a genuine crisis in our economy, and the two are coming together, and that may not be entirely by accident. There's a certain concern with the legitimacy of the governing system. There's polls out showing a majority of the population doesn't think America's democracy will hold. So that's deeply concerning. It should worry all of us as people who have really thrived in a democratic system in a country that has, to some degree, corrected its errors or sought to. I think part of what we're seeing, to connect to this panel, is a bit of a disconnect between the systems of technology production including the licensing, the manufacturer, and the users and the consumers. And so that's generating a lot of the tension at present. So, I mean, I think the shift that needs to happen in our innovation system is to somehow genuinely embed kind of the ethics, the technology assessment, the participation into the development of new technologies. So, there's no one in any corporation who doesn't say, listen to the user, know who your user is, know your consumer, right? It's page 1 of any innovation manual. And yet, if that's the case, then why are we continuing to have technologies invented that, for example, a blood oxygen level that doesn't monitor African Americans in the same way in the hospital with COVID? How is it we have AI systems that recognize certain people and don't others, or that when generating an image of an inventor would automatically generate a white man? So there's some real gaps here that we still need to work on, and where our system is frankly falling short.
Thanks, Arthur. Very good points. Jonathan, your perspective on a formal innovation policy.
Yeah, so I think it depends what you mean by innovation policy. If what you mean is to have a coherent analytical framework for thinking about the types of policies that incentivize the private investment in innovation. If you're talking about the type of policies that address the underinvestment in public research that's inherent in basic research that's inherent to private markets, I think that makes sense, and I think we could have more of that. I think I think the conversation on the patent system in particular could deserve some broader thinking about the implications of where the courts have been going in patent law. But if you mean by an innovation system, a command and control system where the government is picking certain favorite industries, is picking up most of the bill, which is what they did during much of the post-war period, that has had limited successes in very short-term projects, very impressive projects that we've seen in this country, the space race, and you've seen it in other countries. And I think it's tempting to think that model works. But if you look at the longer period of US innovation history, basically our system, I'll go back to where we started, to that holistic idea, right? We've had public money to fund the basic research, but we have relied on the spontaneous order of the private market to pick up the commercialization tab. I'll end with an example. In the 80s, there was a semiconductor industry crisis in this country. And the government actually set up something called Semitech, a consortium where they funded development. This did not work. What did work was a company called Qualcomm, which, building on basic research dating back several decades, invented the technology on which we are currently relying to run this video conference. And that company relies on a patent portfolio. It licenses it out to the whole market. And so I would go back to my symbiosis. Public money is important, but you don't want the public money to crowd out private incentive.
Great. Thanks so much for that. So now we want to, with our remaining time, turn to some participant questions. And so I'm going into the Q&A box here, and first is from Faith. And the question is, how has the increasing connectedness of the internet and the digital age affected innovation itself and the commercialization of innovation? And our panelists want to take on that question.
Would you read that question again?
Sure. How has the increasing connectedness of the internet and the digital age affected innovation itself and the commercialization of innovation?
Let me take a first cut at it, and then Dedrick and others may have more to add. So I would say it's made it more international. So we do see more international collaboration on technology, which I do feel is under threat very much at present. And I think it has potentially enabled, more individual small-scale commercialization, but we've actually not seen either a real acceleration of new technology. if you think about technology in your daily life, the massive change was about 1900 to 1930 when electricity came in your house and consumer goods came into your house that had never been seen before. So I'm not certain we've seen the acceleration that other people often claim, but there I'm very interested what the other panelists think.
Dedrick?
Yeah, I'll chime in and say, I think, I talked about Larry Lessig and Hal Abelson getting together. The interesting thing about policy is that, the technologies advance much faster than the policy can be put in place, or it's always sort of a lagging, right? And the internet has forced us to rethink some of what we think is, we had policies that regulated certain industries because it was improbable that you're going to make copies of records at huge volumes, but copying bits and bytes is pretty easy, and so it forces us to think really differently. So I believe that what I would say the internet has done is given us an infrastructure for connectedness and disintermediation. It's created a whole new industries that weren't there before, weren't possible before. And it's caused a new paradigm for us to consider what it is to convene and come together and copy and distribute. And as such, that infrastructure is really important. It's almost like the infrastructure of the highways in connecting us from the 50s forward. The byways and small roads that my father, when he worked with Dr. King as a civil rights leader, had to navigate to get people from all over the country to the marches was different. Is different now than it was then. And the internet, I think, is one of those accelerating forces.
Valencia? Valencia, we're not hearing you quite yet.
Still can't hear.
Still not yet.
Well,
No. So why don't we go over to Jonathan and then we'll try to come back to Valencia. It's you. Jonathan.
Yeah, I don't have too much more to add on this question. I think it's the internet has definitely democratized innovation possibilities to a certain extent, both in terms of access to knowledge and in certain innovation sectors, reducing the capital required to enter the industry. But going back to innovation policy, we are seeing a diversion of VC money towards internet specific and consumer facing technologies, and a diversion away from some of these sort of pre-digital but still very important infrastructural type of technologies and chemicals and things that are very important for the climate change issues. And while we can't be certain, the weakening of the patent system may be playing a part in that diversion of private capital.
Great. Now we have a next question from Mike Dawson, and this one is particularly directed to you, Valencia. So hopefully your mic will come back on. The question is.
So let's check. Can you hear me now?
I can. Perfect.
Thanks
Thanks so much. So I'm going to ask this question, but feel free to also comment on the last one. I just want to get this question out there as well. So can you and the panel speak about the maker movement as an engine of innovation outside of the traditional models? In parentheses, I am also thinking about the Obama administration's South by South lawn as a high-profile demonstration of what's possible by government taking a high-profile inspirational role.
Well, I completely agree, and that we are responsible and accountable to taking a leadership role. So I agree completely. Not sure much more to add there. I would like to, though, as well, discuss the last, and I apologize for my issues with audio, but I think the greater technology and access that we have through internet and all has had a great profound advancement for technology, especially internationally with other offices, and being able to harmonize so that we can better protect inventors and their inventions. But it also has
You dropped off for a moment, Valencia, but we see you again.
Do you? Okay, thank you. I think it's also forced us to be more vigilant about protection of that innovation. It's made it so much easier to steal someone's ideas and to replicate and fraud. And it's something that we have to be greater enforcers of protecting that innovation because of the advancements in innovation, especially with the the internet and how
Let's give Valencia a moment to come back.
I am back. I apologize. Something that's really disrupting my internet and my access today. So I apologize, but I'll stop there. I think, as my last point was, really, we have to be much more vigilant in protecting, because of the access globally, much more vigilant in protecting against fraud and theft of ideas.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And you might already be doing this, Valencia, so apologize if I'm saying something that's completely redundant, but there's often on these things, the telephone number in. So it might be that your cell phone, if you have one, and you could
Yes.
just connect by audio, you won't be able to see you as much, but if you're, you know the idea. So I'll stop there.
Yes.
But we
yes.
very much want to hear more of your comments, so I don't want to lose you. Other panelists talking about now the maker movement.
I'm happy to pick up on the maker movement.
Sure, thanks, Peter.
And what I would say there is that I think the maker movement is kind of really the democratization of making, right? So that it provides a new infrastructure and increases the accessibility. We think about a traditional, quote unquote, traditional American commerce where in rural areas, grandma and grandpa sat on the porch and they whittled and they created and they sewed. And that now creates us having the opportunity through 3D printing and the like to create something that's unique and customizable to our particular need. And that as a concept is actually really important, because if it's unique and customizable, yet applicable beyond the unique and customized instance, then you actually have something that could be a thing, right? That could have some commercial potential. And the more you spread that out across the country, the more you have the ability for people to see themselves as entrepreneurs and creators, and that becomes that infrastructure that really does sort of fuel a new economy. And I think that's extremely important. So I'd say that on the maker. I want to make one other point on the sort of the public-private idea here, is that often if you think about, and this is one that Jonathan, you made earlier, we spoke about in the NSF Innovation Corps and our start there. I don't know that many people know, but the NSF Innovation Corps is a public-private partnership. We started in the very beginning with the Kauffman Foundation, conversations with the Lemelson Foundation and the Despandi Foundation to ensure that there was this understanding that the things that happened, that came out of the research, would be picked up at the right time through the private sector. So you're absolutely right to say that the public dollars can get it to a point, but the private market is much more efficient at being able to figure out and maneuver this into the marketplace, and articulating that, impedance matching that combination well is, I think, what really carries the day.
Perfect, great. Arthur or Jonathan, views on maker movement or basically anything else at this point, because we're going to wrap up shortly.
I love maker movement. I think what we do in Spark Lab is kind of a maker plus, in that it seeks a more open-ended outcome. A fair amount of the maker movement is pretty determinate, like you're trying to make something that someone else has made already, or kind of following a path. On the other hand, it does teach some critical skills in use of tools and technologies, and then can open up people's ideas for something else they want to build or make and get it out there. So it's really great there in connecting between the physical, tactile, what you build with your hands, and the thought process, and motivating people to say, I want to learn something more about engineering because now I see the use of it. So I'm all in favor of it on that front.
All right, thanks. Jonathan.
Well, I don't have anything specific to add. I think those were terrific comments. And it sounds like we're going back to the individual inventor roots of the U.S. innovation system.
Yeah, I think that's right. And so as we bring this to a close now, I just want to underscore a little more. I think a couple points Jonathan made, but some others on the panel. First, by bringing us back to the statement about democratization of invention. And that, of course, is, and Zarina Khan's name was already mentioned. And so she has done some wonderful work in this space on exactly that. And of course, Jonathan's work too. I would just add from my own research too, an important thing to think about in innovation in the US system, as was mentioned, is that it was very different from the British patent system in that in the US system, from the beginning, patents and copyrights are entitlements, which sometimes sounds like a dirty word, but it is not. What that means, especially on the patent side, is that the PTO cannot use its discretion, grace, and favor like the old British monarch to decide who gets a patent, or some bureaucrats can't just decide they like or don't like. They can only reject the patent for specific statutory-based reasons. Otherwise, the inventor has the right to the patent. That makes our system very different. It does make it more democratic in that way. And then related to that, what we need to think about is the difference between invention and innovation. Dedrick brought up quite rightly that we sometimes don't know what we mean by innovation, or we all assume we know what we mean by innovation. But when do we use the term invention and when do we use the term innovation? I will suggest, I have a bunch of other stuff on this, but for right now, think about how we use them in our regular parlance now. When we talk about something happening in innovation in government, so we don't mean a patentable thing in the government, or an innovation in education, often not necessarily patentable, but very much innovation. So invention can be some specific things where they might be patent eligible and patentable, but innovation happens across a much broader spectrum. And as Valencia brought out, that our new head of the patent office is in fact very interested in innovation more broadly. And I will just, anyone who's not noticed, our rebranding at our center, that's one of the reasons now we are not just about IP anymore. IP is the core, but it's still intellectual property by innovation policy. So stay tuned for more discussions about what we mean by innovation more broadly. And now I want to thank all of our speakers here and also let you know that Arthur will be putting up a final slide for a poll that we hope you will then take. But so let's give the virtual round of applause to Valencia, to Dedrick, to Jonathan and Arthur. And let's thank our Lemelson Center hosts for this, for really putting together, again, a fantastic program. We do this every year, and this has been an excellent addition to the long string of collaboration we have. So thanks all. Arthur, you can put up the slide. Round of applause for everyone, and then we all see you soon.
And thank you, Sean, for moderating. That was fabulous.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Nice meeting you. Thank you.
Bye all.
Bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
All right, everyone, have a good one. Bye-bye.